Imagine the executive team wants to know the stability or volatility of sales across different stores. You may come across a question like this. For example, which stores are reliable in their performance and which ones are risky? I need this for cash flow planning, the CFO may ask. The reliability of performance or riskiness in performance is indeed pointing out to stability in sales versus variability in sales. And here our solution is the statistical metric standard deviation. Let's go to our Rossmann sales dataset and calculate the standard deviation of the sales for different stores and try to answer the concern of the CFO and tell him or her that which stores are reliable in their performance and which ones are risky. So let's get started. Let's now calculate the standard deviation of different stores. For this, let's create a new sheet and let's call this as standard deviation of stores sales. What we would like to do is to calculate the standard deviation of individual stores. In our data set, we have 100 stores, which means we would like to calculate the standard deviation of all these stores separately. If we will calculate the standard deviation of all the stores together, we will be able to answer the question if there is an overall variability or stability across all stores. But here the question of our CFO is that which stores are reliable in their performance, which means we want to identify the standard deviations individually. So let's give some labels. We start with identifying all the stores that we have. Since there are 100 of them, we can actually create this list for 100 stores. And here we have our 100 store labels. And here we will calculate the standard deviation of each store independently. Basically, this will imply applying a filter so that we can extract information of only the store that we want to have and proceed further. How will you do that? You start with the following formula. So standard deviation for the whole population. And before proceeding, we apply the filter. The filter is applied as follows, that which values do you want to use for calculating the standard deviation? That's our sales value in our clean data. So we go to clean data and we select column D. So this is corresponding to the standard deviation of which parameter you want to calculate. And next, you need to specify what is the criteria for selecting those values. The criteria for selecting these values is that our store ID, this should be equal to 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, it should be equal to this cell. How do I read this? And you close the bracket. How do I read this? I read it like following, that let me just fix this formula first. I read it as follows. Look at the clean dataset, column A, which is the store ID. If that column ID is equal to this cell, in this case 1, because now we want to calculate the standard deviation of store number 1. So for this data, for this filtered data, take the value sales, D column is representing sales, and calculate the standard deviation. In this way, you are calculating the standard deviation of store number 1. If I simply copy this formula to cell number 2, basically now we are calculating the standard deviation of sales of store number 2. In this way, we can drag the formula to the complete list and this will give us the standard deviation of sales for each store individually or independently. Now we have the standard deviations. And now the question is, which of these standard deviations are representing a high volatility versus which ones are representing a stable performance? First of all, let's sort this data so that we have an overview to what is the maximum standard deviation and the minimum standard deviation that we are getting for each store. So now we can select the two columns, go to data, and sort the data. We would like to sort by the standard deviation column from largest to smallest. And here we see that store number 57 has the highest standard deviation with 3685 as the value. This should not come as a surprise because we know that store 57 is our top performing store. It is the one where we have the maximum sales coming out. As we can see from our sales stats, this was the one which had the maximum sales, and this is the one which is doing the best, so it has a lot of variability, and this actually makes sense. But again, coming back to our question, how do we divide this information? How do we interpret this information as to whether a specific standard deviation should be regarded as a high variability or should it be regarded as low variability or stable performance? For this, we need to calculate a couple of more factors. We need to know what is the mean of our standard deviation, and we need to know what is the standard deviation of our standard deviation. This is interesting because we want to see that what is the mean of all these values. So what is the most common standard deviation? And we also want to see what is the variability between or among this all variability in itself. So let's calculate these two values. So the mean of our standard deviation will be, you calculate the average and you select your data. So this will give you the mean of standard deviation. So some stores have a high standard deviation, some stores have a low standard deviation, but the average standard deviation, the average variability is coming out to be 1827. And now we calculate the standard deviation of these standard deviations. So we get the STD EV. We go for all the data points. We select this, and this is coming out to be our standard deviation. This doesn't end here. Now we need to calculate two more values. We need to find a range, and anything within that range will correspond to a medium standard deviation of stores. Anything above that range is a high variability, and anything below this range is corresponding to low variability. So let's calculate the thresholds for our top and bottom of the range. So the upper threshold and the lower threshold needs to be calculated. The formulation is simple. You take your mean and you add your standard deviation. This will give you the upper threshold. And you take your mean and you subtract the standard deviation. This will give you the lower threshold. So let's do this. So this is equal to mean plus standard deviation. And this gives you the mean minus standard deviation. And this is our range. Now we compare these individual store standard deviations within this range. And if it is between this range, if the value is within this range, then we say it's a medium standard deviation. If our standard deviation is above this threshold, then it's a high standard deviation, which means it's high variability. It means it's not that stable, it's risky. Anything which is below this is very low variability and not at all risky. So let's do this. And we can calculate the high, medium, low using a formula. We can start by typing if, and we can specify that if this value is greater than or equal to this value. In this case, we can call this as a high variability. But if it's not higher, then we do another check. Now our check can be that if again this value is less than our lower threshold, less than or equal to our lower threshold. In this case, our variability is low and risk is low. And if this condition becomes false, then it means we are between the two ranges, and this will be our formulation. So how do I read this? If the standard deviation of a store is higher than this upper threshold, then you specify it's high. If it's not high, then you check if it's between the range or below the range. So for this, you check if this value, your standard deviation, is below the lower threshold. In that case, it's low. And if neither, then it's medium. So as expected, our standard deviation for store 57 is high because this is higher than the upper range. Now we just need to fix one little thing, which is Excel specific, before we copy this to the remaining stores list. The only thing that we need to change is that when we drag, then these values should be updated, but this cell should remain fixed. And you can do this by applying a dollar sign over here. Let me show you what I mean. If I drag this right away, then you will soon see everything remains high, although it is not really because the formula is updating itself. So in this case, in the second column, in the second row, basically you can see that the formula has shifted 2 cells over here. If I go further down, then you can see that this formula has shifted itself to further below. And since we don't want this F column to be shifted below every time we copy, we want it to be fixed to these 2 cells, we apply a dollar sign. Let me first remove this from here. And the dollar sign should appear to the cell which we want to be fixed. So we put an F3. So no matter if I drag, the cell F3 should remain as it is. And over here, the cell F4 should remain as it is. And now if I drag the formula down, then I can see that even if I am dragging it below, the cells which it is pointing to remains fixed. And now I can copy this formula to the rest of the list. And now we have our numbers. And here we have a very nice partition. So these stores are above the threshold, and we can specify that these stores have a high variability. A high variability is showing that some days the sales is very high, and on some other days the sales are very low. On the other hand side, these stores have a low variability. Please note that low variability does not mean that their sales is low. It simply means that their sales is stable. If it is high, it is consistently high. If it is low, then it is consistently low. It doesn't have too much of variation. All the rest, they form the median, and they are coming in the medium range. So these are the stores which have a medium variability. Sometimes they vary, sometimes they are stable. So this information is good enough for our CFO, where we can specify a list of stores with high variability and high risk, a list of stores with low variability and low risk, and the rest of them with medium variability. And of course, we can always go deeper into more details like the mean of each sales stores, the minimum and maximum for each store, and so on and so forth. It depends on how much information our CFO needs to make the planning. What we just did here is to convert this broad business question, that which stores are reliable in their performance and which ones are risky, we converted that into statistical terms and used a statistical metric to answer a business question on stability and volatility of sales.